somewhat entertaining and interesting and informative. I came up with the idea of calling this presentation CISO for an hour. Having been a CISO, I thought it might be a good idea to share some of my experiences as a CISO for a larger organization, hoping that most of you in the audience may be aspiring to move into a role like that someday. And for some of you that may already be seasoned veterans, hopefully you'll pick up a couple of tips along the way. Just by way of a little bit of background, I've been in information technology about 30 years. I started really young. 16 of that's been in information security, and 16 of it's been in healthcare. I've got a couple of certifications. My last role, I was the Chief Information Security Officer for Mercy Health, which is the largest not-for-profit hospital system in the state of Ohio. 24 hospitals, 35,000 employees, pretty decent sized organization. I also managed the security program for the Cleveland Clinic's 9 community hospitals, and I'm a board member of the Cleveland InfraGuard. So some of the learning objectives I want to achieve today is helping you understand some tips in getting that job, as well as some of the actions to take when you first step into that role. Because depending upon how deep things are, you'll need to know whether you should be wearing galoshes or hip waders. And then become familiar with some non-technical tasks in the role. Frequently, people that move into a role like that may be somebody that came up through the technical ranks, and you'll quickly learn that there are a lot of non-technical aspects to the job that I think are important to be aware of, and lastly, have some words of wisdom along the way. As I mentioned, the primary intended audience is for people that are technical or manager level people looking to move into a CISO role, an information security officer, or a director of security role. And everything that I'm going to talk about doesn't give you any guarantees. It's mostly just for insights. I think one of the most important things in getting the job is focusing on 2 aspects of your experience in the interview that has little to do with your technical abilities and more about how you can lead people. Because at the end of the day, if you're getting hired into a leadership role, the person that you're reporting to wants to know, can you lead a team of people? And also, can you manage projects? Because an awful lot of what you'll find you have to do in any organization, despite the level of their security program's maturity, is knowing that you can deliver on projects, because there will always be new projects that have to be implemented. There will be upgrades that you have to do, and the whole assessment process for filling in the gaps in the program, because those were things that weren't on the roadmap, perhaps, for any of your predecessors. I think that you should make the opportunity to interview the company that you're looking to secure a job with as much as they're interviewing you. You really want to make sure it's a good fit. It's an unforgiving job, and it comes with a lot of stress. And so I think what you should be asking are these questions in particular. Understand what their corporate initiatives are. And that's really a wide open question, and it covers a lot of ground. You'd like to know a little bit more about where have they been, where are they at, where are they heading? And that could be anything from what acquisitions may they be looking at. They may not be able to tell you specifically that they're looking to acquire other companies, but it may be good to know at least that they're looking to grow, because that could add a whole dimension to your responsibilities in terms of assessing any acquisitions or mergers. And who knows, it could affect your job, both positively or negatively. And you would like to know if that's something on the near horizon, like, okay, I'm getting hired tomorrow and we're starting that next week, or is that something that may be 12 to 18 months down the road? Beyond acquisitions, I think it's a good idea to understand maybe a little bit about what sorts of products and services they not already have, but which ones of those may be new, or which ones are they looking at launching. Because I would hope that you would be involved in participating in some of those activities, because many of us have been in a situation where security gets bolted on at the end instead of baked in along the way. Security initiatives in flight and on the books would be more specific to what you'd be working on. It's good to know coming into that role maybe what's already been achieved, what sorts of things are they aspiring to accomplish, and to what extent are they aware of those things. They may be looking to you to come in and tell them what they need to do. Depends on the level of maturity of the organization. Ask what's expected of you in the first 90 days. There's a couple of reasons for that. Obviously, the most important one is that's usually your evaluation period, and you want to do well. But also, it's good to know what they're going to expect of you so that you get off on the right start. You don't want to be heading down the wrong path and find out that you should have been doing something differently based on what they were expecting. I think it's really important to understand the management style of your boss. Every interview that I've ever been on, I ask the person that would be my boss that very question. I don't like to be micromanaged. I like a boss to do the two fundamental things that I think all bosses should do: provide direction and remove obstacles. If I'm micromanaged, I won't last long. And I like to know what their management style is. Now, they could say one thing and be completely different, but I think it's better to ask the question than not to ask it at all. And lastly, I think it's important to know where security sits in the organization. There's a different dynamic if you report up through the CEO in IT versus reporting to risk management. Sometimes CISOs report directly to the board. Sometimes they report to finance. Sometimes they report to risk management or legal. It's a completely different dynamic based on where you are in the food chain, and it helps to understand that context when you're stepping into that role. So let's assume that you get hired. I would suggest that you confirm the expectations that were set during your interview, because things may change. We all know that the HR cycle doesn't happen right away. You may interview for a position that you actually don't start for a couple of months. Well, that's 2/3 of a quarter. That could really impact what the priorities are, and maybe they've changed. So it's a good idea not to walk in assuming that the expectations that were set are still the ones that exist. So just ask the question, is what we talked about in the interview still how you'd like me to prioritize my focus? It depends too on if you're taking over an existing program or building a new one. When I got hired at Mercy, we were building an enterprise security department from the ground up. We had some markets that had a pretty decent security program with people that did security full-time. And then we had other markets where the network engineer wore the security hat when necessary. So understanding what you're getting into is important because it will help you create the strategy and vision necessary to realize whatever those expectations are. If, on the other hand, it's a rather mature program, you probably want to be asking questions about, well, where are they in a maturity scale? Is there some sort of framework in place where they are measuring their level of maturity? And if not, you want to get your arms around that, because then you can figure out, well, what do I need to do to help take the program to the next level? Risk assessments would be key, seeing if they have any done, taking a look at the results. I would hope that if any risk assessments were done, that there'd be some action plans, and what's the track record of completing those things. You may find that you've inherited quite a number of audit findings that need to be addressed, and are those tied to risk assessments at all? And also, if they haven't done any risk assessments, you should be prepared to recommend some risk assessment framework and get started. And obviously, you'd want to have them help you identify where the most important information is and start with those systems first. Identifying budget is important. Do you have one? What's it look like from a capital and an operating expense perspective? And we'll talk about that. When I first was hired, the line items for security were actually part of the data center budget because they were looking to build an enterprise security program. There was no cost center for security in and of itself. So part of the work that you would need to do in a situation like that includes figuring out what your budget needs to look like and work with the appropriate people to move existing budget into a different structure. The other thing I'll mention is it's a good idea to ask questions about the history of the budget. I found out, I got hired the middle of November of that year, and I found out that there was a line item for identity and access management that was about 2 years old. The capital had rolled over one fiscal year and then a second fiscal year. And so one of the things that was set as an expectation is we need to get started next year, which was about 6 weeks, in building an identity and access management program and making some investments, because if we go a third year, that capital may not be available anymore. So that became something that I had to prioritize. So you want to dig a little bit deeper into questions about the history of the budget and not just know how much money you have to spend. I think it's critically important early on to build strategic relationships. It was sort of ironic. One of the first two people that I met when I went to my orientation at the home office were internal audit. I bumped into the two ladies in the hallway, and we struck up a conversation, and that was the start of a great relationship. And I'll tell you a couple of stories about that along the way. I think what else is key is something that we'll talk about near the end of this discussion, which is incident response. And building those relationships early is very important, because security will have to work with marketing, human resources, legal, risk management, all of those key areas that are often needed to be pulled together if you have some sort of a crisis or an incident to deal with. And the sooner you build those relationships, the better. Another thing that I'll recommend to you is after I started, I got myself involved in reviewing contracts from a security perspective. And you can build some political capital with the legal team, because I always turned their contracts around very quickly, because invariably something came across my desk that required quick response. Sometimes I had to rely on the legal department for a quick turnaround. Well, if I've established a reputation with them as somebody that turns their work around quickly, if I pick up the phone and call them and ask them to return the favor, they're most likely going to do that for me, because you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. I think that you want to ask this last question. You want to be diplomatic about it, but what you're looking at or looking for is, the locus of power are the people that make decisions. Maybe they're the people at the corporate office. And what you want to ask is, what do I need to know about interacting with this, certain person, whether it's the head of legal or the head of HR, because maybe there are certain unwritten rules about how you interact with those people. And early in your career at this organization, you don't want to put your foot in your mouth by doing something that you wish you had known about. And maybe by asking some people, maybe even your boss, just say, based on your experience working with these list of people, are there any things I should know about their management style, the do's and don'ts in interacting with them? And that goes a long way in helping you have a smooth road and transition into this new job. If you're building a new program, there's a couple of things you should consider. You'll probably be asked to define an org chart like I did. I had about 14 people reporting to me, either directly or indirectly. And I came up with this idea of creating a services catalog. If you're building a new program, it's a good idea to have people understand what your services are. So initially, I think we broke our department up into 3 areas of focus: security engineering, security compliance, and user provisioning. And that helped us focus on where we needed to place people. Because remember, I had some people that had been doing security as a full-time job and other people that kind of wear that hat when necessary. Well, as you're building your org chart, you need to figure out, well, how am I going to move people around? What opportunities will people be interested in looking for? And that will help try to solidify what that org chart needs to look like. Also, referring back to risk assessments and the methodology that was used is a good place to start too. If this is a new program and there isn't much history there, it's an opportunity for you to put your fingerprints on that program, make it your own, and help shape the way it needs to be. You also want to inventory the security technology. You want to find out, what investments there are. When I started at Mercy, they had a centralized logging system that was defunct. It was running on old hardware, it had old software, and the disks were full. Nobody was using it. So one of the quick wins that I strove to accomplish was I needed some visibility, and I thought it might be a good idea to outsource that, and we were able to do that. And so I got some visibility, scored a quick win, but it's also a good idea to understand what the technology inventory is, not just from a functionality perspective, but from an age perspective. Because remember, I started in November. So in the first quarter of the following year, I was already expecting to have to do budget forecasting for the year after that. Well, understanding what the state of the technology was would help me make recommendations about the investments that needed to be made, not only in maybe replacing technology, but even just doing upgrades. Sometimes upgrades are more than just the software. You get to the end of life of hardware, and you're not necessarily interested in moving to a different vendor, but you want to refresh the hardware. Well, that takes money. And lastly, you want to understand the operational ownership of security technology. And this widely varies from organization to organization. If we went around the room and asked people to share what their organization looked like, we'd probably get a lot of different answers. Sometimes the security department manages the firewalls. Sometimes it's the network team. You could run down the list of technology. Understanding who owns what is important, especially when you tie it back to that earlier slide about building relationships. Communications is a big one. This is where some technical people that come up through the ranks struggle, because you have to be good at communicating technical ideas and issues in a non-technical way. And when you're interacting with people at your level or higher, these emails, meetings, phone conversations, and text messages are all different methods of communicating. They all have their own etiquette, but at the end of the day, they have one thing in common. You need to try to boil down the issue or the communication in simplest terms. And as you move into a C-level role, you'll find this for yourself. It's very difficult to keep up on all the expectations of you. And so you appreciate when people communicate with you in a concise manner. You probably want to ask some people that you interact with frequently at that higher level what kind of information they prefer to get from you and how they'd like it. Because then you can tailor your communications based on what they're looking for. Some people like more detail than others. And you want to err on the side of caution and keep things concise. But if they're interested in more information, over time you can kind of develop that expectation and rapport, because what you want to avoid is striving to be concise and then find out that they'd like more detail, so you wind up getting emails back from them asking questions. Well, can you go into this or can you go into this? And sometimes it's easier just to pick up the phone. I mean, one rule of thumb that I like to try to follow, if possible, is if it's going to take more than 3 email exchanges, why not just have a conversation? Because it's a lot more efficient. So again, learning how much detail is enough based on the communication medium. Obviously, you can't communicate as effectively in an email as you can on the phone, and texting is even more limited. Wanted to come back to building relationships for a minute, especially in the context of communication. So a rather interesting thing happened when I was at Mercy. I mentioned that I started building a relationship with the internal audit folks. Well, at the time, I wanted to look at bringing in some sort of a risk assessment tool that was quantitative based, and we wound up selecting FAIR. I had Jack Jones come in, for those of you that know him, and run a 2 or 3 day training course for me and my team. I invited risk management an internal audit to that training. I paid for their seats, and I said to them, the only expectation that I have of you is that you sit through the training, if you can afford the time, and just learn about the tool that we're planning on using. If you find that it may be beneficial in the work that you do, I'll budget for licensing and pay for it. But if you've already got something that you want to use, that's fine. And that was well received, and internal audit and risk management did attend. Both of them declined to use the tool, not because they didn't like it, but because they had other things that they were already using. Well, unbeknownst to me at the time, I laid the groundwork for something really important. Internal audit did an audit of the data center, and they brought in a pretty high-end tool that spit out one of these big reports, and it ranked a finding as high for all the servers that had this obscure, I'm not going to go into the detail of it, but it had a somewhat obscure vulnerability. Well, I wasn't sure I agreed with that. In fact, I knew I didn't agree with that. So I did research, I wrote a report, I used FAIR to prove that if we fixed what they asked us to, we would actually cause more problems in the environment. And I think what helped was not only having a solid argument against fixing it, but because I used FAIR and they sat in on the training, they understood the story I was trying to tell them. And they changed the audit finding to low. I'm like, that's a good day. So I called Jack and told him about that success story. I think it's important as a new leader that you establish some regular communications with your team. I remember shortly after I first started, I called a phone call meeting with everybody because we were all spread across the state of Ohio, and we actually had somebody in Tennessee. And just, kind of introduced myself and talked a little bit about my vision and some of the things that I thought we needed to address and accomplish. You'll find, and for me especially, having come from the Cleveland Clinic where everything was about an hour within each other, all of our meetings were in person. And this was a completely different dynamic. Because my team was spread so far across a geographic region, all of our meetings, not just security, but IT in general, were done on the phone. It's a much different dynamic to get used to. And so it's even more important to keep that line of communication open where possible. I had weekly meetings with my direct reports, and I tried to get involved in some committees, and it may be a good idea to start some committees. When I was at the Cleveland Clinic, we created something called the Information Security Technical Advisory Forum, called it ISTAF for short, and we held it monthly. And we invited people from the security department, key people from IT, and some of you, especially if you've been in healthcare, you know that oftentimes these shadow IT groups exist where a department has its own funding and enough clout in the organization that they hire their own IT staff. So we wanted to try to get those people coming to our meetings, and we also had physical security come. What was interesting about the Cleveland Clinic, and is still true, is that their physical security force has legal jurisdiction in the entire state of Ohio. Because they get people, or at the time when I was working there, they'd get foreign dignitaries coming for open heart surgeries and things like that. So they needed a police force that had that extension. It was good to have them on our meetings because we got to share information about what each other was doing. So starting those committees is another way to build communications and relationships. So for some of you, this might be very boring because it's old hat, but I didn't want to make any assumptions. So just talking about budgeting for a minute, you need to know, does your fiscal year align with the calendar year, or is it one of those situations where the budget cycle runs from July 1st to June 30th? That can make a difference. The definition of capital expenditure versus operational expense. Capital is typically an asset. And you want to work with your finance department to understand what their rules are for what can be capitalized and what can't. On the IT side, you'll often find that they identify a certain value of equipment or software that you buy. where it goes from being an expense to being capital. The other thing that's important to note is that in some organizations, they may allow capital to roll over to the following year. Other ones may not. Operational expense never rolls over. It's always incurred during the fiscal year. So that becomes a forecasting gotcha. You want to make sure that you know that if you're forecasting some sort of, let's say you're going to buy a next generation firewall and you're buying a 3-year maintenance contract, you want to be able to forecast out 3 years what your capital and operating expenses will look like, because the operating doesn't roll over, and if you don't budget for that in years 2 and 3, you will have a budget deficiency, and that's not good. On the same topic, an accrual is something that can catch you if you're not aware of it. So let's say that that next generation firewall has a 3-year subscription and 3-year maintenance. Those are operating expenses. Every month, over 36 months, the finance department will take 1/36 of that against your budget. But if you pay for it all up front, that's cash flow. But on the accrual side, you need to make sure that when you're doing your budget forecasting for the following fiscal year, that you put 1/3 of the cost of that in your budget, because when the finance department takes that out of your budget each month, that will hit your budget's bottom line. One interesting thing is, traditionally, labor is considered operating expense. But some organizations will allow your workforce to be capitalized if their labor is being applied to a project. So you need to make sure that you understand that, so that your capital budget for projects includes labor if you're capitalizing it, and you'll also see some reduction on your operating expense side, because the salaries of those people that work for you that are being funded as capital for a project will reduce the impact of that on your budget. And then managing a cost center, you'll work with your IT department and your finance department to understand what all of the numeric codes are for your budget, so that you know which things get charged to which budget, because you'll likely be approving purchase orders and invoices and things like that. And then I think it's important to know the style of budget accountability. At the Cleveland Clinic, they manage things to the penny. But the CIO at Mercy liked to manage things more in a slush way, so that overall there was responsibility for the budget and meeting it, but there were some flexibility in how much money one part of IT was spending versus another, because if there was an overage on one side, it may be reconcilable because you could identify that there was some slush somewhere else because there was underspending there. And then some things to think about in the first, second, and fourth quarter of your fiscal cycle. It's not uncommon for, in the first quarter, finance won't release capital until near the end of the first quarter. So if you've got project plans, you want to make sure you understand that, because if you're forecasting that you're going to start some project shortly after the new year, assuming that your fiscal year aligns with the calendar year, but the funding isn't available on the capital side until 3 months into it, your project may wind up being 3 months late right out the gate. Q2 is interesting because in that same scenario, the floodgates open at the beginning of Q2, so there's this flurry of spending, and then finance will typically look at the financial health of the organization at the end of the second quarter, and depending upon how spending is going and how revenue is, they may start cutting back on allowing you to spend more money. So you get this 3-month window to try to get some things done. And then the last thing I'll mention is, it's a good idea to have a plan in your back pocket about things that you'd like to do if you had extra money. Because sometimes in the fourth quarter, that's what happens. Somebody makes an announcement, we have this money that we need to spend. The first person that can step forward with a project that we can review and approve gets the money. So if you've got a couple of things in your back pocket that you can respond to an opportunity like that, you may be able to spend some money this year on something that you had forecasted next year because you were prepared to talk about that. Department meetings, building relationships again is important. What we eventually did in my department was we met 4 times a year. Typically in the first quarter and third quarter, we did a team phone call that lasted a couple of hours. And then the other 2 times of the year, second quarter and fourth quarter, we had a big team meeting. We got together, and it was typically a full day. But the night before, we all went out to dinner, and you can build some great relationships that way. The meeting agenda was really the same for me. You know, your team is going to be heads down every day, fighting fires and keeping up on project demands, and they will forget over the course of 3 months or 6 months just how much they accomplished. And my team always appreciated it when we reviewed all of the things that we had accomplished either since the last meeting or in the past 6 months. And they're like, wow, no wonder we're so tired. We really got a lot done. And oh, I forgot about doing that. And then the other thing is looking ahead. So it helps set the stage for, you know, it got them excited about what we accomplished so that we could talk about more work that was coming up. I think it's really important as a leader to know how to run a good meeting. How many of us get invited to a meeting by a person that we roll our eyes and we're like, we're never going to get anything done in this meeting? So here are some of my tips. You want to send an agenda out in advance because there are some people that are introverts and they would like some time to digest what you're planning on talking about instead of being surprised when they show up. The format that I like to follow at times is, here's the list of topics we're going to talk about, and here's the times that I've got allocated to it. People respect you when you manage a meeting to a schedule, and I would say that, you know, skipping the minutes for a moment and talking about the parking lot, this is a really good idea because if you're trying to be a good leader and run a good meeting and you want to stick to your agenda, there may be some great dialogue going on, and there may be some ideas that get thrown out that are important but aren't necessarily germane to the topic. If you create a parking lot and make a note of that, it lets people know that you value their input, their ideas are important, and that this is a topic that should have its own meeting. You'll find that people are more willing to share in a meeting when you ask them to come up with ideas if you're making that parking lot. It's a good idea to take minutes. Whenever I was running minutes, or meetings, I took my own minutes, and I always put action items at the end of the minutes, and then for the next meeting, action item review was always the first agenda item because it fosters accountability. You can ask people what their status is, and after a couple of times of having meetings and people give you the same answer, well, I haven't gotten to that yet. You can rely on those relationships you've been building and go back to that person if they're on your project team but they don't report to you directly, and ask for some assistance from their boss on how to help them get the work done that you need them to. Gaining consensus. Here's a tip that I have found to be effective. It's rather subtle, but it makes a big difference. If at the end of a meeting you're trying to get some consensus and you ask the question, is there anybody that, or does everybody agree with this decision? People will tend to feel silent peer pressure if they disagree, and so they may raise their hand and say, I agree, but then they walk out the door saying, there's no way in hell I'm going to agree to that. If you ask the question, is there anyone that can't agree with this, you're giving them permission to disagree. And it opens the door to discussion, because then the follow-up question is, well, what will it take for you to reach consensus? So it's a subtle way to open the door to communication, and that will help make your meeting more effective because you at least have some confidence knowing that when people walk out the door, what they said is what they meant. Performance reviews is a part of your responsibilities, and you'll have to set goals that align with the company, with the department, and with the individual. You heard Daryl talk this morning about the importance of training, and I agree with that. To the extent that the organization will be willing to fund training, take advantage of it, I think the only thing worse than training people and having them leave is not training people and having them stay. That can be a detriment to your program. How are we doing on time? You may find that there are formal employee engagement surveys that take place in your organization, and some of your department goals may be tied to the outcomes of those things. And they will typically ask you to identify 2 or 3 things that are areas for improvement, and maybe there would be one thing that you see as a strength, and what can you do to sustain that. So those are some goals. Documentation is very critical. I have to be very careful how I share this story with you, but I think it's definitely worth telling. Documentation is very important. On the positive side of performance reviews, it's good to capture emails and other things along the way throughout the year that reflect positively on some of the people that report to you. Because you're going to forget about some of those things. And if you document them, you can pull them out at the time of performance review. And it not only helps you formulate your answers to their review, but those are good things for you to share with those employees during that performance review. And it lets them know that you thought that the things that they did that were noteworthy were important enough to save so that you could, talk about them. However, it's also important to document conversations that you have with problematic employees, because you never know what's going to happen. I guarantee you that nobody's going to pull you aside and say, hey, guess what? This one person that's underperforming in your department has been meets expectations for the last 5 years because their previous boss ranked them that way. And so when you start to document conversations about that person, and for 2 years in a row, that person gets a needs improvement and doesn't get a raise, and pick your poison, whether they file a complaint with HR based on age, race, or gender, you're going to be in the hot seat to show that it's none of those. In fact, this person wasn't a good performing employee. And you have to hope that, in my case, that when this problematic employee met with leadership, within the first 5 minutes, that person put their foot in their mouth, and it was very clear that there was a chip on the shoulder and had nothing to do with whether I had an issue with that person's age, gender, or race. Documenting is very important. And if you've not been through something like that before, you don't want to have to turn that conversation into a he said, she said. If you've got documentation that shows, here are all the issues that we talked about, here were the actions that we agreed upon, you've got a very solid foundation to stand on to defend yourself if something like that happens. And lastly, you want to provide some sort of career path for your team to the extent that you can. I want to talk about projects for a minute. I think it's very important to know how to do project management time forecasting. If you're not familiar with the methodologies where you're doing PERT analysis, or even doing things like the standard deviation of a critical path of a project, it will serve you well. Just a quick story. One of the projects that we had was a rip and replace of encryption. My predecessor purchased an encryption product and threw it out to each market to implement, and we really needed it to be implemented in an enterprise fashion. So we sat down and we did a time forecasting analysis, and we estimated that it was going to take us about, 15 months. And after we applied some of the mathematical analysis to the project, we extended the project by 11 weeks because we had underestimated how long it was going to take. And what was interesting was when I sat down with my boss and went over the length of the project, he said, wow, I didn't think it was going to take this long. And I said, well, that's because as humans we tend to underestimate how long it takes to get things done. Now, I didn't say this to him, but I'll share it with you. Why is it that in organizations we don't have time to do things right, but we have time to do them over? And I would rather build that into my project plan up front. And as fortune would have it, halfway through that project, we had a reduction in force, and a number of the resources allocated to that project were gone. So over the next several months, we started falling behind. Because this was a compliance project, we had to pull resources in from the outside to help us get it finished, and it took about an extra 2 months. So, despite the fact that the project came in late, think about if I had not done that forecasting analysis with the scientific methods. We had added 3 months to the original, and now we were 2 months late beyond that. So otherwise, that project would have been close to 6 months late. The two most difficult security projects, in my opinion, are a rip and replace of encryption and building an identity and access management system. Expect projects to take time. I mentioned that there was a line item in the budget for an identity and access management system. We spent 4 years working on getting that up and running, and we were successful. We integrated it with our help desk software, and it automated a fair number of things for us. You want to expect security program maturity to take time. In the 5.5 years I was a CISO, we accomplished a significant number of things. We closed 120 audit findings. We built a pretty robust security program. But those things take time. They're not going to happen overnight. You shouldn't expect that of yourself. And hopefully the organization you're working for doesn't have that unrealistic expectation as well. And also, reduction in force affecting project schedules. I already mentioned an example there. That's a risk that you always want to cite in your project charter. And I put career paths up here again because you'll find that there may be some people on your team that are really good at projects versus the operational stuff. So maybe you want to lean them towards doing project implementation for security work. Couple of tips I have for you. I think as security people, sometimes we miss the boat when it comes to opportunity. We always want to strike when the iron is hot after something bad happens. But let me tell you a story that was in the other direction. So we had an incident that required an internal investigation, and we had a good outcome. There was no issue. But one of the reasons we had a good outcome was because I had visibility into activity on the network based on our logging system. When I sat down with my boss to debrief him on what happened, I said to him, now if this same situation had unfolded this way, we wouldn't have the kind of outcome we might have here because we don't have visibility in these areas. And he said, well, what do you need? So I put together an analysis to get budget funding to increase our Splunk licensing. So that wasn't a case where something bad happened, but I told a story in a way that helped me get more funding despite the fact that something bad hadn't happened. Innovative thinking can sometimes pay you back handsomely. So it was about 10 years ago this month when I was at the Cleveland Clinic that I realized a major success in my career. I was thinking, we spend time rehearsing disaster recovery, and we would send teams of people out to some third-party company, and we would rebuild our systems. Why don't we do hands-on incident response testing? So I came up with the idea. I partnered with Matt Curtin from Interhack, and we created a laboratory environment where we had real equipment staged, and we staged a live hack. And we had management there and technology people there, and you will learn things in a hands-on test that will never come to light in a tabletop. Well, the following year, we cooked up this scenario where we had a person working in a lab department selling patient information to a private investigator. And just for fun, we had the lab person on the incident response team. So they were an insider that knew what was happening as the investigation was going underway. So 5 years later, I'm at Mercy Health, and we had a real insider incident. Fortunately, it all turned out good. The person that was the bad actor was a third-party vendor who only had access to test information, so there was no patient data exposed. but having rehearsed something like that in the past, it sort of felt familiar, and I think it helped me better lead my team through that investigation. Now, it's easy for me to stand up here and tell you what happened in 3 sentences. That investigation took every day of 6 weeks before we figured out what happened. Now, my point to you is, it's just like disaster recovery. We put it off and put it off until it's in our face, and then nothing else matters. Make the time to rehearse incident response, because it's going to happen in some way, shape, or form, and you want to be prepared for it. Building a peer network is helpful, especially when you get into a position like this. Upper management will ask you questions like, well, what's everybody else doing? If you've got a network that you can reach out to, you can make that happen. Within the first year I was at Mercy, I found out that Mercy is a religious-based organization, as you might suspect. The CIOs across the United States formed a Catholic hospital a CIO network. And one year they invited all their CISOs to come. And so while I'm there, I'm talking to a couple of other people, and I'm like, let's spin off our own group. So we wound up having a monthly phone call, and we just talked about, what are you concerned about? What are you working on? So, you may even use a conference like this to start building some relationships where you start to have a phone call like that periodically. And I think one of the most important aspects to develop in your security program is incident response, as I've mentioned. You want to have plans. We have, in both at the Cleveland Clinic and at Mercy, we built playbooks for specific scenarios. There's a different type of response for a denial of service attack than there is a phishing attack. And even you can get granular when it comes to malware. Some malware will flood your network, like back in the day when SQL Slammer did. That's a completely different response than somebody discovering that there's malware on a workstation exfiltrating data versus ransomware. Having a playbook helps you make decisions under duress and gives you guidance that helps keep you focused. And test those plans when you can. You want to tap into expertise where and when you need it. Unless you're a large organization that can afford to have a forensics team, I think it's a good idea to outsource that, only because if you present evidence in court by people on your team that collected information, a savvy opposing counsel will ask you or ask your team, is this something that you do every day? And if the answer is no, they can shoot holes in the credibility of the information that you've collected. Strengthening those relationships mentioned earlier. So here's another interesting tip that was another hands-on exercise I did. I was teaching my team the value of how to document an incident, because you never know if that information is going to appear in court later, because maybe the incident starts to unfold in a way that you quickly realize that you've been breached. So what I did is I set up a scenario. Again, I worked with InterHack on this. I left the room for most of the day and left the team do some acquisition and collection. And then the following day, we staged a mock deposition, and I was the one being deposed by a real attorney who had e-discovery experience and shot holes in all of their documentation. And the lesson learned there wasn't to give my team a black eye, but the problem that I see is that the technical people will collect evidence that doesn't get used in court for 6 months or a year maybe. And so if you've got good documentation practices, it helps you recall what you did that further down the road. And plus, if you're being questioned about things that you did, not necessarily collecting information, but even just the decisions that you made, it goes a long way. And one of the other things that I'll share with you in terms of the documentation, when I mentioned to you that we had that 6-week investigation, I made a note every time a conference call started with a vendor and when it ended. And that really helped me out, because when it came time to pay all the bills, and they were sending me invoices listing all of the times that all their people spent, I could go back and look at my notes, and because I had remembered to write down when the call ended, I knew how long they were actually on the phone. Those are things that you don't always think about. Any questions? hopefully you all had some takeaways from this discussion. Thanks for letting me share my experience with you.